Dear church, it's wonderful to be with you again to do another lesson on Trail of Trials. And today we'll be dealing with Abraham once again. And Abraham's ultimate test is what we're going to talk about today. It's the second greatest story in all the Bible. And it's about Abraham taking his son Isaac to be sacrificed on a mountain. And the typology here is obviously very clear to us. It's God taking his son to the cross. And Abraham had this wonderful opportunity to be the type in this great story of God. Now, Abraham goes down in history as one of the greatest men that ever lived. Why? Because he was willing to do what God did with his son. Abraham was willing to be like God in this story. This is arguably the greatest trial that any human being has ever had to go through in their lives. The greatest test that any man had ever had to go through. This is the type of story I think that we could spend like 5 hours on just doing lessons about. We can go on for days just extrapolating the depth and the significance of what is happening here in Genesis chapter 22. And with that said, let's go to the text. If you've got your Bible with you, it will be a good idea to have it with you today because we're going to jump to a few texts. So let's go. Genesis chapter 22. I'm going to read from verse 1 and then it goes up to verse 19. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. Interesting, the two things that's going to kill his son. He carries that and he lets his son carry the wood. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, Father, yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And so Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Now, there are loads of things that we can say about this text, but let me just make a few observations to get us going, to get the brain juices flowing. First of all, Abraham chose God over everything. We need to remember that. Abraham chose God over his father. He chose God over his family when he left Ur. He chose God over his home when he left Haran. And now he chooses God over his son. Isaac was between 5 and 12 years old here. Can you imagine how Isaac must have felt when he realized that his father was going to sacrifice him? That was what Abraham was willing to do, even give up his child for God. Secondly, after God made Abraham blessed, he made Abraham stressed. Up to this point, God had only given Abraham blessings and honor. He had given him this land. He had shown his love to him. He had made promises to him. And now God tells him to do something horrible. And Abraham is an amazing example. He says, Lord, I'll take the great things from you. I'll take the blessings from you. But I will also take the hard things that you require of me to do. Thirdly, God knows what is at stake in our trials. It's not like he's unaware of the depth of the pain that it could cause for us. Abraham and Sarah were not able to have a kid. And then God gives them a child miraculously in old age. It's this roller coaster ride of having a child. They've just gone through a very difficult, traumatic experience with Hagar and Ishmael. And now God says, all right, I've given you the son. I've put you through these trials. Now take the son and go sacrifice him on the mountain. And what makes this such a challenge is that God mentions twice in this text, take your son, your only son. God makes it clear that it's his only son. It's as if God is rubbing this in. He didn't have another son. So it's not like if God takes, if Isaac dies that he's got another son lined up. No, it's his only son. It's his only hope. It's the only future of his lineage. And so God knows what is at stake in Abraham's trial, and he knows what is at stake in our trials. And sometimes it looks horrible, but God has got a plan. And just the fourth observation is that the trial is about what we think will happen. It's what we think will happen. Most of the time, we are worried about what could possibly happen. And that's the trial, that's the worry. And most of the time, it never happens. That is what Abraham had to face here, isn't it? He had to face this thought, today I'll be stabbing my son in the heart. He's playing this through his mind. He's playing through his mind, his son bleeding, lighting the fire as his son starts to burn. That's what's going on in his mind. Or Abraham was thinking, today God is testing me to see if I will do what he says, even if it contradicts his promises. Because this is such a famous story, later biblical writers reflected on it a lot. So today I'd like to draw a few things out of the story from 4 different perspectives. I want to look at the story briefly from Paul's perspective, and from the perspective of James, and from the perspective of Moses, who actually wrote down this piece of text. And then I will look at a perspective from myself. And if we were sitting in a circle today, I think we would all be able to add some valuable perspectives. And let me just say as we go into this, that this is really a trial about faith. And remember, therefore, what is written in James chapter 1, verse 3, that a trial is the testing of our faith. So let's talk first of all, what Paul would preach on this text. What would Paul tell us if he was busy doing this lesson with us? Well, let's go to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17 to 19. Now, I assume, and to the best of my understanding, that Hebrews was written by Paul, but whoever it's written by, this is what they had to say about the story of Abraham. So Hebrews 11, verse 17 to 19. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He had received the promises, was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the dead. One point I just want to make here that Paul is saying. Faith is believing the impossible. That's what it is. Faith is believing the impossible. Paul tells us that Abraham was put in a difficult position. God promised him a son through whom his whole lineage would come. God gave him the son then. And then God tells him to kill the son. It's like God is saying, I gave you a son so that you could kill him. Most people would pause here and say, no, God, you are a contradiction. I won't do it. And Paul answers that for us in verse 19. Because it's sort of, we're asking the question, what are you thinking, Abraham? What's going on in your mind for still being willing to go up this mountain and take your son and kill him? What goes on in your mind? Now, Paul taps into Abraham's mind, it seems like in verse 19 when he says, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. So Abraham knew that even if he did kill his son, God would raise him from the dead. Abraham was so certain that God can do this that the text in Genesis 22 indicates that. Because in verse 5, he tells his servants, don't worry guys, we will be coming back. Go read verse 5 again. And then in verse 8, he tells Isaac that God will provide a lamb. So Abraham knew that he was going to sacrifice a lamb on that day and not his son. Even if he did kill his son, he knew at the end of the day it will be a lamb that will be sacrificed to God, because he knew his God's heart. And he knew that his God was able of keeping his son from staying dead. What's the lesson that we can pull here? Nobody had ever seen a resurrection up to that point. People of Abraham's time could not even imagine somebody being raised from the dead. But Abraham believed it. And that is why he's the father of the faith. He believed the impossible when the impossible was unimaginable. So what can we take from this? Sit back and consider your trial. Is there anything God cannot do in your trial? Pick the most impossible thing that you need to see happen. Pray about it, believe it, and see what happens. That's the idea that I get from Paul. He believed the resurrection was possible when nobody else could even imagine it. And what does James say? Turn with me to the book of James, chapter 2, verse 20 to 24, as James talks about Abraham. You foolish man, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see that a person is justified by what he does, and not by faith alone. And what James is teaching us here through Abraham is that faith is nothing without action. You see, when James sat down to write a theological position of how works complete faith, he chose the story of Abraham. Imagine for a moment, Abraham is sitting at home and God approaches him and asks him this question. Do you believe that I will raise your son from the dead if I ask you to sacrifice him? Do you believe it? Do you believe that I can raise your son from the dead? Abraham would say, yes, wouldn't he? He would. But how will God know if his yes really means yes? How would God know if his faith in God raising the dead is really legit unless he puts him in that situation? And you see, sometimes that's why we are put in the situations, because that's the only way that God can test us. What's the lesson here? It is easy to sit back and say that God can do anything. It's easy to sit back and say that God is good and will make things work out. But until your actions don't reflect what you believe, your faith is empty. It does not help we sit in church and in Bible studies and we profess the great possibilities of what God can do, but our actions don't complete it. I mean, what do they say? If you pray for rain, buy an umbrella. So where does this leave us? If you believe God will bless you even when you suffer for His name, continue to suffer for His name. If you believe God will release you from your trial, then act like it. Abram went up and down that mountain with a smile, and if he didn't believe God would raise Isaac from the dead, he would never have gone up that mountain. You see, when God sees our actions, He unleashes the armies of heaven to prove our faith is true. But when we say we believe, but remain seated, nothing changes. God keeps the armies of heaven seated where they are. So if we want the armies of heaven released and into action, we need to get our faith into action and prove what we believe. And then there's the third individual that sort of gives an interpretation of what's going on here. And that is Moses, who actually writes this text of Genesis chapter 22. And I'm just going to read it again. And I'd like to point out verse 8 and verse 14. I'm going to read verse 8. When Isaac asks Abraham, where's the lamb? Abraham answers, God Himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And then in verse 14, a beautiful text says, so Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. I see here that when Moses tells us the story, he's actually pointing out that faith is trusting that God will provide. Abraham named the mountain, God will provide. And that shows us what the experience meant to him. It was about God's providence. Moses takes it further and he mentions that even in his time, people refer to the mountain with the saying, on the mountain of the Lord He will provide. I see here that Moses is reflecting on the idea that if a sacrifice is to be made, that God will provide it. And that is what God did with His Son Jesus Christ on the cross, didn't He? Someone had to be sacrificed and God provided that sacrifice. So what's the lesson here? If you're climbing a trial today, if you're climbing a mountain, you are probably wondering if you will ever reach the pinnacle. You are wondering how you will solve the problem at the tip of this iceberg. We learn here from Moses that God will provide everything necessary to resolve the issue. But that is only if you keep being obedient and you keep climbing the trial and you don't sit down and you don't give up and you don't stop trusting and believing the promises of God. Now, what would I preach? I would say 2 questions and 1 statement that I'd like to give you all today. First of all, the following. The first question would be this: what if your trial was meant to inspire someone else? What if that was the purpose of your trial? If I say the word Abraham, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Faith, isn't it? Isn't that what Abraham has been known for right through the Bible? What Abraham did on that mountain has been the inspiration for thousands of people for over 2,000 years. It forms the heart of Paul's soteriology. Romans and Galatians reveals the truth stated in Genesis 15 verse 6 that God considered Abraham righteous because of his faith. We get right with God through our faith, not our righteousness. For the last 2,000 years, people have placed their hope in the faith that Abraham demonstrated in Genesis chapter 22. He's our inspiration. And consider Isaac for a moment. How did Abraham's actions affect Isaac, do you think? One would assume a bad dad will be the type of guy that kills his son, right? A son who survives an attempted murder from his father would not be very impressed with his dad, wouldn't he? But in Abraham's instance, it had the opposite effect, I believe. Imagine when Isaac got older and he had the conversation with his dad and said to his father, "Dad, why did you want to sacrifice me on that mountain that day?" And Abraham answers, "I wanted to be obedient to death, to God. He's the supreme ruler of the universe. He always keeps his promises, and I knew it would all work out. I figured that he could raise the dead. I figured that he could raise you from the dead even if I did kill you. I wanted to obey God no matter what. Even if it's my most prized possession I had to give up, I would do that because the God of the heavens is powerful, He's majestic, and He's my God." And I think that example of his father set the tone for his son Isaac, right? For the rest of his life. I want to honor God to the extent that my father did. You see, Abraham has been an example for the Christian generations of the earth. He was an example to his son Isaac that was carried over into Jacob and to the 12 tribes of Israel. That's why they called him Father Abraham. So what's the lesson here? A trial is an opportunity to inspire someone else. People are watching you when you go through a difficult time, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real life illustration and teaching moment for others of what it means to trust in God. Never forget that weaker people are watching you handle difficult times. A second question that I take out of this text. What if your trial existed to reveal your faith? What if your trial existed to reveal your faith? In 2100 BC, the time that Abraham lived, it was not unusual to sacrifice your child for a god. It wasn't unusual. Years later, we read about people sacrificing their children in the fire to Molech. In 2 Kings 3:27, the king of Moab sacrificed his firstborn son on the wall to his God to find favor with his God. This is detestable practice, but it was common. And when God told Abraham to sacrifice his son, he knew it was just a test. He knew God's character, that he was unlike the other gods of Canaan. He wasn't into sacrificing children. God was not in the business of killing children. The people of the other gods of Canaan, they did it. And they must have heard about this story about Abraham and his God going up on a mountain, going to sacrifice his mountain, and then God provides a ram to be sacrificed. I think that they were in awe of Yahweh. The pagan gods did not do things like that, but Abraham's God provided a ram right there. I can imagine Abraham's attitude as he left for the mountain. God is testing me to see if I trust His character. Now let me pass this test. What's the lesson here? How do you feel when you write an exam? You can dread it or be excited to see how well you do. You won't know if you have a strong faith until you have passed or failed the test. So I reckon we must turn our trials into exams that reveal to us what we are made of and also reveal to God the same thing at the same time. God rewards us for good marks. And then there's a third thing, just a statement. It does not matter how bad it looks, it will be glorious. It doesn't matter how bad it looks, it will be glorious. Whatever it is that you're finding or fighting at the moment, it doesn't matter how bad it looks, it's going to be glorious. Imagine a man walking up a mountain to kill his son. It looks bad. And the request is from God. But if you read the story backwards, it is surprisingly glorious. I'm going to read to you verse 15 to 18. The angel of the Lord called to Abram from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. The story ends gloriously. What's the lesson? The top of the climb is the beginning of blessing. It's at the top of the mountain, the most difficult part of this trial, that you will experience the greatest blessing. So don't give up. A few concluding points that summarizes everything that has been said. Faith is believing and acting like God keeps His promises regardless of what things look like. Secondly, faith is only complete faith when accompanied by action. Thirdly, faith is believing that God will provide what is necessary at the end of our obedience. We've got to remain obedient. Fourthly, what impresses Jesus and inspires people is faith. Fifthly, a trial is just an exam on faith. Be excited to go through the trial. It will test what you're made of. And lastly, no trial ever turns out bad if God is in it. May God bless you. Love you guys. Have a super week.